Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge webinar series. Just so everyone knows, next week on Tuesday, 22nd February, we'll be having our next webinar on contributing towards the SDGs. We'll have a special guest host that session from SDSN. Her name is Katie Roll, so look forward to that one. Hope to see you all there. But on to today's session, as usual, I'm your convener today, Sean. I'm joined by my colleague, Jackie. You can see she'll be facilitating today through the chat. So if you have any questions that you would like to pose to us somewhat anonymously, not to the whole room, just send them to Jackie. That's Jackie Garcia in the chat. And we're excited to have you all here, both live and on the recording. Some of you may have joined since we launched the series. So just so you know, this is a reminder that all the recordings can be found online and on our website or on the CrowdSolve page. So post-event materials will also be shared there on both those channels. So there'll be some interesting ones for you today. So look out for those. I'm joined today by three speakers who I'll introduce you to in a moment. But first, let me just go through some housekeeping. This webinar and its transcript is being recorded and it'll be available online through the channels I mentioned before. If you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your video and or mute yourself. We will share the recordings and the slides with you following the event. So as I mentioned, today we'll be hearing from three speakers. So while they're speaking, please mute yourself to avoid any distractions. And you can turn on both your video and mic for the Q&A portion. It'd be great to get some live questions. So please feel free to use the hand raising function during that section, which I think is on the top toolbar on the far right. It can be found on the bottom or top of your screen, depends. We will then call upon you. Additionally, the chat will be open to questions and comments from our audience throughout the event. And as I mentioned, if you would like to send that anonymously, just send that to Jackie and we'll read them out in the end. If after this webinar, you're watching the recording and you still have some questions, or you just would like to continue the conversation following this, or for example, you have any resources, just feel free to communicate and discuss in the relevant CrowdSolve page in the comments section. It'd be great to get some discussion there. Whenever you all are working on this section of your design, you can all collaborate in that area. And remember, this year's webinars are organized around the different elements of the assessment criteria. So everything that we discussed today, you'll have to address in your own design. So I encourage everyone to ask questions of our panelists while you have them. Today's session is building off this section of the assessment criteria just here. How well have you considered how people will be able to access and afford your product? Consider affordability, potential customer payment models, and existing financial models. So today's session is building off a little bit of last week's section on business models. So particularly helpful for our predominantly engineering student cohort. So I hope you get something out of today. The webinar's agenda is here. We'll be having the introductions we're going through now, and then we'll have our speakers present, followed by a short Q&A, and then our regular surveys and closing. So without further ado, let me just introduce you to our speakers. So first up, we have Moses Nyakayo. He's the co-founder and director of finance of Kijani Testing. He's a chartered management accountant with over 15 years experience working with startups across Africa. He's also dedicated the last 5 years working with startups in clean tech in the renewable energy space, working with innovators of clean tech to enhance product accessibility and scalability. He's also a country winner 2021 founder of the Year East African Startup Awards. So welcome, Moses. Thank you for joining us today.
Sure.
Then we'll be hearing from Tilak Nathwani from M-KOPA. Tilak is an economist with product, project, and financial management experience. He has specific experience developing inclusive digital finance services for underbanked customers and has ensured effective financial management, reporting, and compliance for sustainable development grants funded by a range of bilateral donors and private sector clients, including MasterCard Foundations, UK FCDO, and USAID. As senior manager at M-KOPA Labs, Tilak applies design thinking, system practice, and market research to enhance the utility of rural digital financial services for customers, leading early-stage pilot implementation and project reporting. Additionally, he provides technical support on M-KOPA's carbon credits portfolio and impact on ESG reporting. He has extensive field experience in sub-Saharan Africa and is fluent English and Swahili speaker. Tilak also holds a BSc in economics and finance from the University of Sheffield. So welcome, Tilak. Thank you for coming. Finally, we'll be hearing from Mohammed Shehryer. Shehryer is the founder and managing director of Harness Energy. The company aims to provide reliable and affordable solar products, solar lanterns, home systems, and efficient appliances to low-income Pakistanis. Harness Energy works with multiple Verisol certified manufacturers and microfinance institutions to effectively deliver these products at the last mile. Shehryer has an MA in economics from Duke University on the Fulbright Scholarship and is an Acumen Fellow. Apart from a passion for renewables, he is interested in cricket and astronomy. Thank you, Shehryer, and thank you for coming today. So without further ado, Moses, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean, for the introduction. Welcome the attendants. I hope that I'm clear. I'm audible enough, Sean?
Yep, sound great.
Great. So I'll just jump into the presentation. I did a small slide setup just at least to be able to cover within the time given. So I'm a founder of Kijani Testing. So what Kijani Testing does is we test innovations in clean and renewable energy space. So we test the functionality of the innovations. We also test the marketing aspect of the innovation. So pretty much how the potential market can respond to any particular sort of innovation. So the whole idea is to help the innovators understand what the market needs, to be able to understand what the market expects from a particular innovation, and to be able to understand what the market would be willing to pay for a certain type of innovation. Next slide, please. I think we've pretty much gone through this. Yes. So I did a bit of, there's a bit of data here I got from different sources. This was pretty much talking about the level of accessibility of energy across the globe. So this data available shows that 13% of the world population don't have access to electricity. And that translates to about 1 billion people. And then there are about 40% who have got absolutely no access to clean fuels for cooking. And this translates to about 3 billion people. So pretty much the relationship between access to energy and incomes is a very, I would pretty much say it's very directly related. What I found out from cable.co, the UK, is that the average cost of energy goes for about 0.165 kilowatts per hour. And this was from a study done from about 230 countries. And the average need for poor household in terms of the energy consumption translates to about 20 kilowatts per hour, per month, I mean. So therefore, if you work the numbers around, it means that a particular poor household will spend about $3.3 a month just to be able to consume a bit of energy. And I decided to narrow this data specifically to Kenya, where we operate. So I would pretty much explore more about Kenya and how it is important for the Kenyan market to check the level of accessibility of these off-grid appliances or off-grid equipments vis-a-vis the level of affordability within the Kenyan market. And I would pretty much say at this point that Kenya would be very relative across sub-Saharan Africa. So the data that would probably be shared will pretty much reflect the level of performance across the sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in Kenya currently, the latest study done by the World Bank sometime towards the end of last year was that about 40% of the population live in extreme poverty. And the cost of electricity in Kenya, it goes for about 0.21 kilowatts per hour. And that is about 30% higher than the global average. And it is very interesting because the cost of electricity in Kenya is one of the reasons why off-grid appliances tend to be very much acceptable in the Kenyan market. Because again, the costs that we are given out here are pretty much, as you can see, it's almost 30% higher than the global rate. Yeah, so it is very important that the innovators working on these off-grids should be able to at least factor in the cost-benefit analysis that are going to arise to the potential end users, particularly in this part of the market. Then in terms of being able to achieve accessibility, it is very important that you as the innovators, you ensure that your product functions and is able to meet the expected performance parameters. This is one of the selling points of being able to at least attract a potential customer to consider your product. There's also a very key aspect in terms of distribution of the product, the channels that you choose for distribution. So Kenya is pretty much still, I would say there's a bit more acceptability in terms of online sales and so on and so forth. But for a particular target market, Kenyans still tend to be a bit more receptive to manual distributions. So for instance, you have to get involved with a certain distributor who can get your products and push them to different parts of Kenya. Online purchases are pretty much just starting to pick up. And this is pretty restricted to, I would say, more enlightened Kenyans. A vast majority of the population still use the internet for very basic needs. Very few of them actually get involved with purchases. So the distribution channels are pretty much still very conventional. So it's important that the innovators actually factor this in terms of how they want to move their products to the market. Then it's another important aspect that we come to realize is the level of functionality and product warranty. So what we have seen over time is that the innovators have got very beautiful warranty plans, pretty much how they plan to support their products after sale. But in terms of implementation, there's been a big gap in terms of supporting these end users. So you find that an end user buys an appliance, an off-grid appliance, uses it, some technicalities arise. For the end user to get the proper support tends to be either takes too much time for the support to come, or it doesn't really come at all. So this is one of the areas that we feel that really innovators need to be a bit more keen towards, because again, this touches directly on the level of acceptability of off-grid appliances. I mean, if innovators can be able to at least bridge, pretty much even manufacturers, so to speak, can be able to at least fulfill their warranty agreements in time and to the fullest extent, then it creates a bit more room for more people to accept the use of these off-grid appliances and equipments. Yeah, and then the other thing that is extremely important to check out in terms of accessibility is trying to consider the feedback that is received from potential end users, because then we, as part of what we do, we've realized there's a bit of a gap between what the innovator has in mind and what the end user has in mind for a particular product. So if the end user looks at a product and believes that it can meet needs X, Y, and Z, it's important that the innovator also formulates this particular product to respond to the needs X, Y, and Z. One example I would give is one of the products we had tested, I would consider it a very innovative product, but the response that came from the end users was that there's a bit of a gap between what the innovator actually presented and what the end users are expecting in terms of performance and in terms of interactions between the end user and the particular product. So this is an extremely important aspect for innovators to look into, so they're able to meet the needs of the end users and also be able to use that as an avenue to launch in the market and as well as scale. Then it's also important to continuous research and development on these products. It's very important that the needs that keep on changing with time are also reflected in modification across the products that are going to be presented in the market. Next slide, please. So in terms of affordability and directly narrowing down to Kenya, I decided to actually share a bit of research in terms of the level of income for the Kenyan market. And this is a research that was done sometime, I think, in 2018, early 2019. I don't think much has changed in terms of the income levels of the Kenyan populace. So you realize that there's a very huge number of Kenyans, particularly households who pretty much have very little to negative income per month. That translates over 200,000 households. And then the households that are pretty much making a bit of income that can be able to sustain, the numbers keep going down. The more the income, the numbers of those kind of able to make the income levels keep going down. So pretty much means that the purchasing power within the Kenyan market is very much restricted. because of the levels of income that these households have. Therefore, it is extremely important that innovators should be able to factor in the income levels or disposable incomes available for their target market. It is very difficult, for instance, to develop an innovation very nicely done with all these beautiful aspects of it. But then in terms of the selling price or pretty much the cost that you intend to transfer to the end users are off their limit or off their scale. I think to back this up is you realize, I think probably the CEO for M-KOPA will discuss it more. You realize that the Kenyan market tends to be a bit more receptive to pay plans. So pretty much not many Kenyans can be able to buy off-grid appliances upfront. They're a bit comfortable with getting a bit of pay plan. So you ask them to pay a bit of an initial deposit and then another period of 6 or 12 months that they can be paying in installments. So this is one of the ways that Kenyans have been able to acquire some of these equipments, and it directly just relates the level of incomes that are available within the Kenyan market. I would say this is pretty much reflective across the sub-Saharan market as well. So it is very important that when you are trying to approach your market, you know what is their level of acquiring some of these innovations that are being in place, so that even if it means that a bit of modification has to be done on the innovation in terms of utilization of complementary materials, materials that are a bit affordable yet still sustainable, it is important that such factors are considered. Next slide. So how then do you achieve this affordability I'm talking about? I've mentioned a bit on materials. It is important that you also try and work on your production line to minimize wastage so that these costs are at least minimized. It's also important to try and do away with unnecessary product features, and this directly ties to continuous research and development that I've mentioned earlier on, so that as your product is in the market and as it is being used and as it is being taken advantage of by different end users, you're also continuously researching and trying to see certain expenses that you're incurring in production of the particular innovation, and seeing whether you can be able to do away with them without necessarily affecting the functionality of the particular appliance that you're working with. It is also important to choose most effective and affordable distribution channels. As I'd mentioned earlier on, that Kenya is still a very conventional market. Most people tend to use conventional means in terms of purchasing. So it is important that the distribution channel that you pick does not add unnecessary cost to the end users. I've seen cases where innovators have come up with a particular product that the cost of production is even, I don't know, maybe about $300. And by the time the product goes to a particular distributor, the margins that are put in by the distributors push the product completely off the budgeting scale of a majority of the households, of a majority of the target market. So it's extremely important that the distribution channels that are picked do not add unnecessary cost to the innovation and do not directly impact on the cost of the selling price of a product. It is also important to continuously negotiate with your suppliers to ensure that you're getting the best value for your money, as well as getting the best possible materials that you need, so that, again, this can be transferred to the end users to make your innovation or your product a bit more affordable to them. I would also say that trying to offer a bit of discounts for cash purchases is one of the ways that you can be able to achieve affordability. And this works pretty well if you're trying to work with the market psychology of a particular target market, so that instead of offering a pay plan, which comes with a bit of interest attached, you can as well try and negotiate for them to buy your appliances in cash and get a bit of a discount for the same. So, I mean, these are some of the areas that really you need to look at when you're developing your product, because at the end of the day, the product has to reach the market, and the market response to the product is extremely important going forward. I think I'm within time, Sean, and my slides is pretty much over, if I'm not wrong.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Moses.
Yes.
Great introduction. And I think, yeah, it's really important for the students to understand the importance of intimately understanding your end user and the market they're operating in. So thank you for that. I think some great tips as well for the students here. If you have any questions for Moses, we'll have the Q&A at the end. So store them up, put them in the chat, or get ready to raise your hand. But next up, we have Tilak. And actually, Tilak is you're going to control your own slides because has a little bit of a model to take us through. So let me just stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it over to you, Tilak.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Moses, for the introduction as well. Hope you don't mind, I've made a few notes myself. And I believe I should be able to share screen. Great. That should be connecting. But Sean, if you don't mind letting me know as soon as that is visible.
Yeah, will do.
And
there we go.
Great, thank you. So I have one slide, and then I thought it'd be quite fun to dig into like a little calculator that I've made for this presentation as well, that I'll be sharing after the webinar as well. So feel free to have a play around yourself. So in terms of determining what is affordable in the markets, I'll be sort of approaching this from a very sort of early stage sort of design and development process, which is primarily what my role is as I work with M-KOPA's labs. So one thing I would mention as well is that this is sort of focused around the pay-as-you-go setting, but I'll sort of touch on very briefly some other sort of credit models and business models that you could explore as well. So one thing to mention, affordability is seen in different, sort of through different lenses. There is, of course, the overall measure of gross price. You know, by the end of the pay-as-you-go payment plan, what is the customer paying? So that's definitely one measure that customers look at. But one thing, but there are more measures and there's more considerations for a customer. One point I'll just mention up front is when you're sort of looking at pricing, think about it's definitely been helpful for us to think about whether you're replacing an existing solution for your target customer base or you're introducing a completely new product to them, because that might influence how you weight, which is what here I've just set out as like the general pay-as-you-go payment plan, which is your gross price is an initial deposit that customers pay depending on the value of the product itself, plus of course the cost price per credit, which is our sort of micropayment, daily repayment. We have daily payment terms, but there's flexibility around that. Then of course multiplied by the number of credits. What's quite the reason I've kind of spelt this out is because each element or aspect of this equation, there are different considerations to it. So of course, a customer, as I mentioned, will view the gross price and think about it as overall value for money. So what are they sort of getting by the end of the payment plan? And as Moses mentioned as well, there's an element of credit. So customers will assess sort of how yeah, exactly that sort of the value of the product itself versus purchasing it on a pay-as-you-go basis. The deposit requires upfront cash. So that also is linked to affordability. So if you increase the size of the deposit, you might actually price customers out of the accessibility. Then of course, the cost per credit is it helps customers understand how payment plans fit into their budgets. I mean, it's the same way as every time sort of my phone or contract provider gets in touch with me about an upgrade, I think about how that might break down into monthly terms and so on and so forth. So the cost per credit is very important as well, especially when you sort of look at the distinction between replacing an existing solution or introducing a new product to them. And of course, the number of credits will dictate the length of the commitment as well. And if relevant, you know, a customer might even think about their break-even point or when they start recognizing savings. So this is very much sort of focused around the pay-as-you-go model, but of course there are other types of credit as well. Buy now, pay later. I've done a lot of work with smallholder farmers, so there's what we've called pay-as-you-grow. So farmers might purchase a solar-powered water pump, but only start paying that back once they've sort of harvested and sold their produce. And of course, sort of cash loans and traditional credit is also sort of available. So you're also looking at that as in a way a sort of competing mechanism to pay as you go. In terms of sort of understanding, especially like affordability and how this breaks down, there are several sort of data points that you could leverage, existing data points as well, around different markets. So as Moses mentioned, some of them as well, World Bank data, SDGs, they all have quite a rich data set where you could look at sort of the macroeconomic and income distribution side of things. I've used that a lot in terms of market sizing to try and understand what is the overall scope in terms of affordability and how does that aggregate up across a sort of up to a national level. And of course, drilling down into more detail, you have sort of financial diaries and microeconomic data from the likes of CGAP and GOBLA. And they really look at individual sort of household budgets. They keep financial diaries with survey participants. So you can really see sort of on a day-to-day basis, what are customers spending? What are they spending it on? And of course, this data is all sort of accessible and quite fascinating to review as well, depending on the markets that you're looking at. So I mentioned, I've pulled in a really small example in terms of, and this primarily revolves around the cost per credit and the daily sort of budgeting exercise that customers will go through. And I've just sort of, and these numbers are all sort of like, just placeholders. So I should have labeled this, but this is basically sort of M-KOPA is known for its pay-as-you-go lighting, essentially displacing kerosene lanterns or oil-based lanterns. And a customer might look at that saying, I normally spend 50 cents a day, but a payment plan for a solar home system might be 40. So immediately there's savings that customers are recognizing. In the case of here is let's say there's a bigger sort of diesel powered generator or a water pump that customers are spending, let's say 70 cents on. But currently, based on what's available in the market, there might be a solar powered solution that's more expensive. So customers might see that as potentially like future savings to recognize as well. Once they pay that off, it becomes their asset, or they might generate additional or incremental income as well, especially in the case of productive use. And of course, there are co-benefits such as improved health and quality of life that customers do factor in. But this being sort of focused on affordability, I wanted to just sort of, call those out. And of course, there's tons of, research toolkits, including willingness to pay, the financial diaries, displacement costs. So again, for the example of lighting, you could look at how many hours a household might use kerosene lanterns. You might look at sort of the cost of kerosene for an hour, and then you can essentially aggregate up or calculate how much customers are spending on a daily basis to displace, which also is, I'm going to use that opportunity to quickly run through this model, which will help you think about how all of these different factors are interconnected as well. Because one sort of fine balancing act that we're always careful to do very early on when we're developing pricing plans is, what does the product cost us as a business? And then what does the product cost a customer as well? And between then, there's a solution that is both affordable to the customer and viable to the business. So over here, I've just sort of over to the right, left, you'll see a brief, like almost like a little calculator that helps you, and you can fill these in. This is just placeholder values in terms of what does the product cost, what are the components? It could be a battery, panels, light bulbs, and so on and so forth. And of course, it'll, depending on where you're manufacturing the product, it might take, there will be additional costs involved with like bringing it to, your market or your customer. That's one important piece. And of course, a big part of pay-as-you-go is the cost of finance as well. So that's another sort of section as well here. I should mention, where there's green, you can just enter any figures you'd like, depending on sort of what your cost base is. But here, what I'm trying to show is there is a delicate balance, or a balance, I should say, between what you spend in terms of production, what it costs you to finance or sort of, implement the pay-as-you-go model, and then what the customer pays as well through their pay-as-you-go pricing plan. And over here to the right, I've broken down those three elements of the pay-as-you-go pricing plan, which is the initial deposit, the cost per credit, and then the number of credits or the length of the payment plan in terms of days. And I also wanted to highlight here that the link between the two is also, you can extend a payment plan as long as you want, but it'll take you longer, that much longer, to then recover the revenue and the cash and then pay back the loan as well from the bank that you've taken to sort of finance the asset. So in the interest of time, I'll pause there. I think I might be running short of time, but I think I'll be sending this across. So feel free to have a play around. It essentially has the business side of things and the unit economics or the unit costs of the product. And then over to the right, thinking about affordability and some notes on dynamics to consider as well that I mentioned, sort of deposit being too high, cost per credit, and sort of length, duration of the plan. So that would sort of, help you find that through play, that balance between sort of, total price to customer, total cost of the business, and in theory, what is your margin contribution to the business as well that provides the platform for you to be able to scale and continue developing new products and R&D and customer service and the like. So I will pause there.
Thanks a lot.
And hand it back to you.
Sure. Okay, that's fantastic. And the calculator looks great. A simple tool for people to start playing around with and understand how to achieve affordability. So that's great. And we'll share that with everyone following this. So thanks, Tilak. Thanks for mocking that up, and thanks for your talk. Let me just share my screen again, so that Shehryer can come on stage. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay. So Shehryer, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sean. Yeah, you can move to the first slide.
Sure.
I think most of what I want to talk about has already been covered by Tilak and Moses. But you know what? Let me try and give it a third shot. So just a couple of disclaimers before going forward, that the webinar's sort of heading or the topic that we're talking about considers both accessibility and affordability. But what I'm going to talk primarily about affordability, because in terms of accessibility, I'm assuming that you've done some of your work before you move on to the affordability part. Let's say, for example, if the product requires some special features to be added for people with disabilities or something like that. Or, when we're talking about accessibility in the old school terminology in terms of, the right logistics or the right target market. So I'm assuming you've done bulk of that work, and then we move on to affordability, which has been something very, very close to our business and has taught us a lot of lessons. So let's move on to the first slide. Just a basic accounting formula that I've made to make things clearer. When you sell something to a customer, there is a cost involved in it, which has multiple parts, and then there's a profit margin. I was just looking at the chat. Someone asked the question that, should we be sacrificing our profit margin if the product is affordable in the long run compared to the short run? And I think that's a very tricky question, and that's a very important question in terms of what business you're in. If, let's say, you have some money to sacrifice, if you're even willing to work in terms of breaking even or even make a loss for a couple of years in order to gain a higher market share in the future, I think it depends on the kind of business you're in and your ability to do it. I think that is generally a good strategy, because it's very difficult in the competitive world to run a business and start making regular profits, from third month onwards. So I think that is one consideration we need to have. And in terms of the costing, I think Tilak's model mentioned this as well in a lot of detail. But the basic three divisions would be, the raw material, the variable cost, the cost of like the solar panel or the battery, if you're talking about a solar product, as SHS or a solar lantern. Those are the raw material costs. Then you have certain fixed costs like your office rent and utilities and that kind of stuff. And then you have expenses that are primarily related to sales and marketing and administration. So these three costs in varying different ways add to your cost. And then you determine, depending on the price model that you're using, whether you want to have a 20% margin on your overall cost or a 15% margin. So ultimately, what matters in your business is the net profit, net of all expenses and costs, the kind of margin you're making. And I think a very simple calculation everywhere is that margin should be well above the basic interest rate prevailing in your country. Because let's say if you can get like 8% putting your money in the bank account and the net profit you're making out of your business is 5%, then basically you're putting in a lot of effort over the years, making a loss of 3% because you could have put your money elsewhere. Anyway, so moving forward into this, I think there's some divisions you have to, like I said, you have to figure out. Just 1 second, Sean, just let me spend a little more time on this. So if you're willing to sacrifice profit margins, we did this when we started doing the off-grid sale business in the solar industry because we did not know how to sell basically off-grid products to people. So initially it took us a few months, 1.5, 2 years to find our footing. So you have to figure out what you can do. I mean, the extreme example of this is they're not in the off-grid industry, but Amazon, they're willing to sacrifice money for like 12 years in order to scare competitors away. So that completely depends on which industry you're in. Are the raw material prices fluctuating? This is a big problem for a country like Pakistan because most of the components are imported from China, and so we have a heavy exposure to exchange rate. What is your fixed cost per unit? Let's say very specifically, if you're making a new product and you have to get dyes or molds made for a specific product, then you have to figure out how many number of units you have to produce in order to minimize that unit cost. And then, of course, it's always good to have control over your expenses, whether it be expenses in the field, fuel, entertainment expenses. So especially if it's your own money, if you're on borrowed money, then it becomes even more imperative. But even if it's 100% self-equity, then generally I think people are more financially disciplined. So yeah, let's move forward. So in terms of affordability, I think some of the considerations that are very important, let's say if you're designing a product from scratch, and some of the things that you need to consider that will ensure the product is affordable are firstly, I mean, an off-grid. So from now on, when I talk about off-grid, I'm generally talking about targeting customers that are low income. Most of them have no electricity. Even if the ones that do, they have power outages for a long period of time. Most of them live in rural areas. So this is sort of customer profile I'm talking about. So first, you have to see the need of your product. I mean, engineers, especially students, are very passionate about changing the world, making new products. But if you design something that is really good technically, but it appeals to, let's say, the upper middle class or the elite class, I mean, it might be a really good product like the iPhone, but the iPhone has no place in the off-grid context. So you have to see what the customers are looking for, what their needs are. Generally speaking, what we've observed that a typical off-grid rural family spends a lot of money on food, some money on energy, very little money on child education and health. So you have to be aware of that, because generally speaking, if you're an engineer, if you're studying at a good college, your spending patterns might be very different from the families that you're targeting product to. Are there any alternate options available? Let's say there's a very famous story that Ned and Sam have, the founders of D-Light, the alternates available when they decided to make their solar lanterns were basically kerosene and candles. Now, I guess the world has moved on. So if your product is targeting something, let's say, I don't know, delivering 10 hours of solar energy per day. So what's the alternative? Do the people have grids? Are the people using generators? I recall Moses was mentioning, the grid, like I assume it was a grid electricity cost of about 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Now that is insanely expensive. So, you have to tell that to the customer as well, how getting, let's say, solar would be so beneficial for them. You have to do your customer profiling. And sometimes, of course, before the product hits the market, you might not exactly know what your customer profile is, but it's good to get an idea. I'll tell you in the next slide how we did this in our example. So in terms of price sensitivity, all of the families that and individuals that we have talked to in the off-grid industry, and some of them have converted to customers, everyone is very, very price conscious because if their incomes are low. So even you would be if you had a very limited budgeted income. So it's good to keep that in mind. And of course, if your product is good, if it's slightly more expensive than being ideally affordable, it's good to have some financing options in place. Now I'll just give you some of the examples that we have faced in our 5 years of doing business in Pakistan. Next slide, please. So solar products, yeah, okay. Solar products have been, a revelation and a very good one at that for people living in off-grid areas. The government does not extend grid to a lot of places for multiple reasons. So now scale has been achieved where a lot of production is being done in China, and cheap solar panels and LED bulbs and batteries are available to people. Let's say, so in terms of the example that I was giving the last slide, now let's talk about the example specifically from Pakistan. The need is massive. Pakistan has about 20 to 25% of population lives off-grid. And like the off-grid population of Pakistan is actually more than the entire population of Kenya. You know how big the market is, like, Davy, M-KOPA, these companies are so big in Kenya, but Pakistan, the market is still untapped. But this market is being served primarily by bad quality generics. Sometimes they're smuggled into Pakistan. Sometimes, the reject pieces that companies produce, they find their way into the markets, and, it's very difficult for a company like us to compete with them. In terms of customer profile, most of our customers are farmers. Some of them are day laborers. There's generally, so this 5 plus 2 means that there's 5 elders and maybe 2 to 3 children in a typical family, and their monthly income is about 20 to 24,000 rupees per month. And in terms of the dollar exchange rate, this amounts to like $120 per month. So let's say if a customer's income is $120 per month, I guess they'd be spending about $10 to $15 on their energy needs. And if your product, let's say even with financing options, require a customer to pay $25 per month, it'll be really difficult. So you have to keep that in mind. Customers are very, very price sensitive, specifically now that I'm talking about solar. So very price sensitive because this is not something that affects their daily, food intake, calorie intake. So they probably, set aside lesser amount of money for that. And financing options are very rare because, like I said, in the market, the quality standards are not up to the mark. So financing institutions, they're not comfortable lending to people because they're like, what if product stops working after 5 months? I don't know, I have to collect my EMIs for 12 months. So that's a tricky situation. So on the side, I've just given this example. Let's say on the bottom, we are talking about this component-based sort of system where we have 1 solar panel, 1 fan, 3 lights. And just to add, fans are very important in Pakistan compared to East Africa because the weather is really hot and people really want to run their fans on solar. So this component-based system would probably cost much lower than the system, that's shown above, that is Verasol and IEC certified, and gives lesser fan hours compared to the system at the bottom. But the system at the bottom has these problems of, not being able to finance by MFIs, and, it's using lead acid battery instead of lithium batteries. So solar products overall, generally speaking, I think there's been a very good comparison for customers to see that now that good quality products are coming in the market and companies like us are offering them this. So a lot of customers are shifting to this, bottom price, buy the cheapest thing, to companies like us who are, willing to offer them a service contract as well. We'll give you 2-year warranties and stuff like that. So yeah, and moving on to the last slide. Overall, I think once you're developing a product, it's easier to view something in hindsight. Once you've developed something and giving praise to someone to including that design feature in the initial product design. But generally, you don't have that foresight to see what the product will behave like in the next few years when it goes into the market. But there's generally a few things that can help you, and I have these basic 4 examples. So $5 or $3 shampoo bottle would not work in villages with low income. So a lot of people in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, a lot of companies came up with this small 3 cent single-use shampoos and tea and stuff like that, which would make no sense, selling in Western markets or even in big cities in these countries I mentioned about. So this is a big innovation that, if you have to deliver a small quantity of products to customer clientele who have very low income, you can move to this. And a solar lantern, I would say a solar lantern would hardly have any use in a big city like Lahore or Mumbai, but it might have a lot of use in, a village in rural Sindh or let's say Bihar in India. So some design thinking goes into that. And then these small 1 kilogram pouches of cooking oil. I remember when I went to the US to study, everything is like in huge quantity. So you buy this, 2-gallon oil once and then, purchase it after 3 months. But someone in a village, cannot do that much. So that's third example. And then we have these really, really affordable smartphones, a much recent example. Smartphones that might not be doing exactly what an $800 phone does, but they still do a lot of stuff that our customers are looking for. And then I've learned it the hard way, because if you have a very, very strong stiff price-based competition, so your product, if it's targeting an off-grid audience primarily, end user affordability, if not the first and the foremost design feature, but it should be one of the top 3 most important factors to be considered in the product design. Yep, that's about it.
Thanks, Shehryer. Great. I think you did cover a lot that wasn't touched on yet. So thank you for that. Okay, so I think now we're coming into the Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in, raise your hand or type it in the chat. We also have some ones in the chat already. So send those in, but right now let me just check what's here already. So Michael asked, and I think this was answered by Tilak, but let me just read this out for everyone to hear. So Michael's model is looking at using clean energy to drive a pasteurizer, and they want to use this to empower the rural community, but also minimize current running costs. So the question is, how do we decide on affordability if the initial product production cost is a little above what can be affordable? If in the long run they will make profit, how do we explain this to the customers? And Tilak asked, with regards to the pasteurizer model, will you be developing for individual groups or individual farmers or groups? Michael, would you like to answer this?
Sorry, I've unhelpfully answered a question with more questions. But my thinking was just if you can sort of aggregation and with productive use in sort of the agricultural setting, that's a common challenge based on how expensive batteries and everything components are currently. Sort of if you can, one model to look at is focus more on groups, farmers like cooperatives and savings groups. So you aggregate, it becomes more affordable when there's more individuals utilizing. Okay, so you will be delivering a model for MCCs and co-op groups. Then I think, again, if it's a sort of technological problem in terms of, or like the sort of how expensive the technology currently is, I would look at sort of also calling out the income generation angle as well, because that's an important sort of financial consideration as well, because at some point that will become free to use as well, as opposed to sort of, having to spend money on input. So it tends to be sort of, focusing a little bit more on the long term, beyond which a group will have reached break even, and then they'll be sort of maximizing profits in sort of increments, which would be my take on things. But happy in case Mohammed or Moses, you had any other additions to that.
I think Mohammed did a little bit on this in the beginning of your talk. Moses, would you like to feed in at all? If not, if you think it's covered.
No, I mean, I pretty much agree with what Tilak has said. I wouldn't really repeat what Tilak has been sharing, but my biggest concern would be what the end users would really be willing to see in terms of the long-term gains, the cost-benefit analysis, because I mean that is pretty much what is going to determine the level of success that will come up from the innovation itself.
I hope that answers your question, Michael. If not, feel free to. Okay, it's very helpful. So let's see what else we have incoming. I think this is for Mohammed, for Shehryer. Will funders or investors be willing to sacrifice money for a period of time, or do you need to deliver right away? I think because you mentioned a little bit
well, I think
hit.
the off-grid industry is difficult in that way because it can't be compared to typical VCs funding software companies because we are moving, visibly sort of like a hard product. So continuing losses for a long period of time is unsustainable. I think it completely depends on what kind of funding you have. Generally speaking, equity holders are more patient. If you have a lot of your own funds invested and there's an equity holder, I think it should not be a concern, but you should be carefully looking at either to reduce the expenses or increase your revenue. If you have debt, then it becomes another situation completely, because then you have to add another financial cost to your expenses. So if that continues, and if that is about medium to long term, then it could be a serious going concern problem. We actually had a similar situation for us in the last few months. We had two investors, due diligence was done. One of them is a very big name in the off-grid industry, and we had two good ticket sizes. But the problem was that for one of the investors, money had to leave their account by 31st December, and the process was too slow in Pakistan from the state bank's end. And secondly, we figured that given the volatile exchange rate, we did not want to borrow in dollar-denominated currency. So it completely depends on what kind of financials you have. But generally speaking, I think talking about if you're a distributor of off-grid appliances like solar lanterns and solar home systems, if you're entering into a really competitive market like Kenya, I think it's reasonable enough to test waters for 1.5 years and see what happens. But based on my knowledge, I might be wrong on this. Western Africa is generally a less competitive market, so maybe you can make profit quicker over there. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Shehryer. Okay, and the next question is for Tilak. You mentioned databases that provide information on different markets. Are there energy databases that provide information on the alternatives we hope to replace? I think in reference to your model and the price differences.
So that's a really good question. That sort of interest behind it and the sort of data is growing day by day. But as you can imagine, it's quite a sort of fast changing space. I would just check because also my knowledge of the latest is slightly out of date, as like even a few months for me is out of date. But yes, I think if you look at, especially if you follow the organizations and institutions that have energy access as one of their core themes, they tend to sort of aggregate data around not only access to electricity and energy, but also now clean energy sources. Think of the UN SDGs. They have country profiles, market profiles. World Bank has started doing more around energy access, clean energy access as well. So yes, I think that there is more data available, but it might depend on sort of how recent it is and also which market you're looking at. But that tends to be my strategy. Follow the individuals that are sort of at their core. They are trying to solve challenges like access to clean energy. I hope that helps. It's a bit of a general response, but
yeah. I think it makes sense. I think they can also go on the databases you mentioned as well. It sounds like there's some overlap there, as well as the World Bank. But yeah, does anybody else have any other databases they refer to that would like to share now? I don't like specific. No. Okay. I have one last question so far. I think for Moses, it's asking about Kenyan context, what proves to be kind of the most affordable appliance overall?
Yeah, Kenya, I think that's a very tricky question because I really don't have the actual data at my hands. But I would say I would pretty much talk about the products we worked with. And the ones that I've seen that have been really received pretty well in the market are the ones that directly impact on the lives of small-scale holders, small-scale farmers, pretty much appliances that can be used to generate income. So those tend to be a bit more received pretty well in the market because even in terms of, if you look at even the financing model for the same, you realize that the users are very comfortable working with the pay-go because they are getting some financial benefit from utilizing some of these appliances. So I would say the ones that are being used to generate a bit more income tend to be a bit more better received in the market.
Okay, great. So yeah, if you're working on a productive use of appliance, you have that working for you. You can make that case in your project. I don't have any more questions, and it doesn't seem any more coming in the chat. Does anybody have anything else? I also, if the speakers have any questions for each other, I know Tilak mentioned you might have some notes to discuss. Feel free to ask those now while we're waiting for any others. Otherwise, I'll move on. But any questions from any of our speakers or no? No. Okay. Well, anyway, if anybody has any questions later down, if you're watching the recording, feel free to engage in the crowdsolve post, and we'll try to answer them there. But as for right now, let me first thank all of our speakers for coming today. It's great to have you all here and hear all of your expertise on the subject, and we'll share the slides and Tilak's model in the resources afterwards over crowdsolve. So look out for those. So thanks everyone. I think Jackie just shared the E4A challenge email as well, so you can send in questions there as well. So thanks for that. So thanks to all of you. We're just coming up to time, so I wanted to thank you all before any of you had to run away. But just before we go, we also have this short feedback survey. That would be great if people could respond to that now. If you're watching, and if you're watching the recording, please just respond to it as you're watching. This just helps us improve each session and try to hone down these webinars. And then I'll leave that up for a few more seconds. You can follow this QR code or the link in the bottom, and I think Jackie's also shared that in the chat. Please go ahead and do that. And then finally, we have this newsletter sign up. So this will just keep you up to date with everything going on in the challenge, all the webinars coming up, near deadlines, when the prototype windows close, stories that are going on, things we want to share. So sign up to that if you aren't already. That's really useful for anyone participating in the challenge. But otherwise, that closes out the session. So thank you all. Thank you, Tilak. Thank you, Moses. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you all for coming today. Look forward to talking to you in the near future. Goodbye, everyone.
Everyone, thanks for having us.